Former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens published an op-ed today on the New York Times calling for more than just new gun control laws. He wants the Second Amendment to be repealed entirely, although that doesn't necessarily mean what people think it means, I don't think. So we're going to read a couple of excerpts from his op-ed, not the entire thing. This is probably more than I should be anyway, but it's interesting, so bear with me. John Paul Stevens said, in reference to the March for Our Lives and the push for gun control laws, that support, talking about how many people turned out for the marches, is a clear sign to lawmakers to enact legislation prohibiting civilian ownership of semiautomatic weapons, increasing the minimum age to buy a gun from 18 to 21 years old, and establishing more comprehensive background checks on all purchasers of firearms. But the demonstrators should seek more effective and more lasting reform. They should demand a repeal of the Second Amendment. And he goes back through the history of why he thinks that's necessary, and a lot of it has to do with the changing interpretation of what the Second Amendment actually represents, what it says and what it means. For over 200 years after the adoption of the Second Amendment, it was uniformly understood as not placing any limit on either federal or state authority to enact gun control legislation. In 1939, the Supreme Court unanimously held that Congress could prohibit the possession of a sawed-off shotgun because that weapon had no reasonable relation to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. And there's other examples of that as well. If the gun or the ability to have the gun doesn't have anything to do with the clearly worded Second Amendment, then it could in fact be regulated, either at the federal level or at the state level. And he goes farther even more recently. During the years when Warren Burger was our Chief Justice from 1969 to 1986, no judge, federal or state, as far as I am aware, expressed any doubt as to the limited coverage of that amendment. When organizations like the National Rifle Association disagreed with that position and began their campaign claiming that federal regulation of firearms curtailed Second Amendment rights, Chief Justice publicly characterized the NRA as perpetrating, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I've ever seen in my lifetime. And it has been successful because much more recently, just in the past couple of decades, District of Columbia versus Heller decision happened where they did in the end say that certain types of gun control would go against the personal ownership of firearms, having nothing to do with militias whatsoever. And the only reason to get rid of that would be to get rid of the Second Amendment.
Right, so the DC v. Heller case back in 2008 really did change the way people perceived gun rights in the country. So previously, the way that the Second Amendment was interpreted was that a well-regulated militia had the right to bear arms, but the DC v. Heller decision focused primarily on individual gun rights, right? They interpreted it in a different way, and essentially that opened the floodgates for further deregulation of guns. And so what was fascinating about this op-ed piece written by John Paul Stevens was that it wasn't coming from a progressive former Supreme Court justice. It was coming from an individual who identifies as a Republican. And he sees that, you know, the Second Amendment has been misinterpreted, the NRA has become too powerful, and as a result, innocent lives are being taken in you know, these instances of gun violence. And so, look, my read of his op-ed was, yeah, he wants to repeal the Second Amendment, but and this is my own speculation, my interpretation of what he really wants is for people to interpret the Second Amendment the way that it was actually written, right? In the context of a well-regulated militia. But since it seems as though we're unable to do that, then let's... More recently, we've been unable to do that since 2008 when this DC v. Heller Supreme Court case came about and was decided on. It just, we're never going to get any real, you know, fundamental change in gun control unless we repeal the Second Amendment.
Yeah, and I think that this entire topic, you could have a lot of different approaches to it. I mean, you could also say we need to repeal it entirely because even if we were to get back to that old understanding of it, there hasn't been a well-regulated militia in 100+ years. It's nonsense. Some people are saying that this is a terrible idea for him to publish this because this confirms to the right all of their fears that this movement isn't about new gun control regulations, it's about taking all the guns. I would say don't worry about that. They already are saying we're going to kill every gun owner.
You're right about that in that, you know, the NRA has done a fantastic job in spreading their propaganda about what people really want when it comes to gun regulation, right? And so gun advocates have already bought into that propaganda, and there's no changing their mind. But I do agree that his op-ed, it is not representative of what most people want when it comes to gun regulation.
Yeah, I think he's trying to guide them.
Right.
Saying that so long as we allow this modern interpretation of the Second Amendment to exist, all of your efforts at the state level are going to continually butt up against the NRA, Republican lawmakers, and stuff like that. I mean, I said something like probably a month ago now that I think we need an amendment to amend the Second Amendment. Not to get rid of it entirely, but to entirely reword it into something that works not just for those who want gun control, but also the Second Amendment as it's constructed right now doesn't serve anyone's interests because it is far too vague. I mean, I would say with the well-regulated militia part, it's not vague, but in terms of what's well-regulated and what it allows and what it doesn't allow, it's vague. And we know now that the ways that Supreme Courts can interpret it can change massively over time. So I think we need to amend it to say there will be limited ability to own guns for certain functions such as hunting, self-defense, with further regulations of various sorts coming from federal and state laws.
Right.
Or something more specific. I don't have my actual wording down, but that's what I want.
So the Constitution was obviously written in a way to keep things vague, right? It's not meant to be a document that outlines policy. It's supposed to be a document that guides policy. And so the amendments are intentionally vague in some regard, right? But what, John Paul Stevens wrote, and something that I completely agree with, is that the Second Amendment's current terminology and current meaning is antiquated. And so it makes sense to update it, right? And so I agree with him on that.
Let's say we update it once every 200 years.
That would be fair.
Not too much, but
that would be fair because I highly doubt our founding fathers, really considered how much this weaponry would advance. And it's advanced considerably. I mean, they weren't thinking about high-capacity magazines. They weren't thinking about military-style assault weapons. They weren't thinking about, AR-15s and those types of weapons. And so I think it does make sense to look back at the Second Amendment and think about how to modernize it in a way where it will apply to our current society. Yeah. And yes, in a way that benefits both parties, both gun advocates and individuals who want common sense gun legislation.
Yeah. Perhaps not gun advocates who are out of their minds and want everyone to have tanks,
and
but
by the way,
reasonable gun owners.
Reasonable gun owners. And I would argue that the majority of gun advocates are reasonable. Unfortunately, they are being represented by the most extreme individuals in the NRA who, of course, have a profit motive to push out more guns.
Yeah, and just one final point I want to make about what this means. Like, again, I think we should amend the Second Amendment, not remove the Second Amendment. But if you remove the Second Amendment, it does not mean that people can't have guns. It doesn't mean that you round up all guns. There are plenty of countries around the world that have no constitutional provisions for gun ownership, but people can own guns. You could still have laws. There's no constitutional right to smoke cigarettes, but people smoke cigarettes all over the place. There would still be laws at the federal and at the state level regulating what sorts of guns and gun accessories you'd be able to have. So even if we got rid of the entirety of this, it does not mean they'd be coming for all your guns. It doesn't mean it would be illegal to own a gun. That is complete misinformation.
If you want to get the whole Young Turks show every single day, become a member, tytnetwork.com/join. And once you do, you'll be saying,
I'm like a smart person.
Or you might say,
I think it's weird.
Or you might say,
oops.
No, that won't be that one. It won't be that one. It'll be great, trust me. tytnetwork.com/join.